Kingdom Claus Book 2 of War and Snow by Adam David Brown. Prologue. 5 years have passed since Amaranth's attempted siege upon the lands of Claus. Though the northwestern realm has long gone back to its normal routines and daily business, this was only out of necessity and not of peaceful days. For the southern border of Claus was under constant barrage from the bewitched Gordivalian forces, the innocent troops of the southeastern kingdom that still lay under the spell of Kester. A spell of unending torment and hellish slumber that makes the Gordivalian soldiers sleepwalking puppets of the one who pulls the strings, Kester, singer of the vile songs, master of evil winds and words. Kester, dark magician of Amaranth. The grey man who now sits alongside the stolen throne of the southeastern kingdom and is the right hand of King Amaranth. It was Kester's work that completed Amaranth's will and stole the entire army of Gordival, a once great force that now marches to a vile voice and is forever captured in a spell, like flies in a web. The men in Claus's ranks came to call them the Shadow Men, for these darkened troops were not like men, but mindless shells that fought against them at the behest of a mad warlord and at the command of a magician. It wasn't enough that these Shadow Men besieged the borders of Claus at a constant rate. It would seem that Kester's vile power could resurrect those who had fallen in battle to fight for many more times to come. Even if the body was broken and the wounds grave, the bewitched soldiers would fight on as undead vessels in a most unnatural and unholy way. The methods of Kester had continuously gotten more severe and dreadful. The first and second garrisons had long since been retaken, and though the positions were holding, the stations were anything but peaceful. It was almost on a daily basis that ranks of Amaranth's forces would attack the southernmost border of the northwestern realm, and the attacks would become increasingly bold and fierce, like the tide of an angry sea. There was even talk of shadow men attacking the southern borders of the Free Mountains, their ghastly movements hidden by blankets of fog. The chieftains had sent envoys to King Claus for aid, but when the Clausian troops would arrive, there would be nothing in the villages but ruin. It was as if they had been attacked by ghosts. Word of these frightful sieges spread quickly throughout the northwestern realm and the morale of the kingdom began to slowly plummet. By this time, it was no secret that Amaranth had sought to rule all of the north and that he now commanded a mighty army, which was capable of breaking the lines of Claus by force. Amaranth was known as the villain of the north and an iron-fisted warlord who ruled with strength and cruelty. However, now it seemed to the people of Kingdom Claus that he had began waging a war of fear that was crumbling the will of the good folk throughout the northwestern realm. Everyday business was now plagued with doubt and the nights became sleepless with worry and fear. The kingdom of Claus was beginning to break. The vile forces of Amaranth would be held at bay by the holy might of the Clausian army, but that stronghold was upon the edge of a knife. The dark magic of Kester was kept in check by the ever-watchful wizard, Father Frost, but even that seemed to be weakened. Though a wizard may be seemingly immortal, the magic would dull over time, and Frost's strength was starting to fade. He was said to be older than time itself and he had been constantly holding off Kester's dark magic, and it was beginning to take its toll. The lands that had once been blessed with the good father's mirthful magic were now slowly falling into cold despair. The soil was becoming more and more hardened, the yields of the crops became ever dwindling. The air started to blow as cold as a crypt and the winter became more of a tiresome burden than what was typical. The north, by its nature, was a cold land, but within the borders of Claus, it was made temperate by the power of Father Frost. Some of the good folk of the northwestern realm ignored the turmoil and cared only if their ale barrels were full, and if their tables were set every eve for supper, and as long as they had a laugh in their throats, no ill spirit should come to them. Other folk, however, were listless and very much aware of the feeling of looming doom. They were uneasy and felt that the very air was unnatural and abysmal, and that every laugh that roared from their bellies was but a veil to hide a dripping dread. Soon enough, this dreadfulness would weave its way through all of Kingdom Claus and every hint of merriment would be a guise to aid in the daily toils. The poison of Kester had spread from the southeast and into the veins of the northwestern realm, at first, only at a subtle flow, but would become a roaring fever. Death by 1,000 cuts was a method that the vile magician reveled in. It seemed that Kester knew precisely how to work his will, no matter how minuscule it would appear. He was well adept at achieving what he wished, in one form or another. Dark magic has many ways of accomplishing its purpose. Even King Claus himself, as merry and as mighty as he was, began to feel the weaving gloom. For the first time in his rule, he doubted the power of his kingdom and started to realize that such power was not everlasting, but instead frail and finite. He knew that hard days had befallen him, but was slowly becoming unsure of how to handle things. The affairs of his kingdom were now much more than simply budgets and trade agreements. War was the shadow that remained over his head. He had heard the messages from the far garrisons and knew all too well of their plight. He knew of the exhausted troops and expended resources, and felt that at any moment, the walls of the first garrison would be breached and hell would step foot upon his lands once again, but that has yet to have happened. It was as if the pendulum was stuck at its farthest peak in one direction and would not swing back to fulfill its promised journey. It was this very tension that was beginning to crack the kingdom. Fear had blossomed in the northwestern realm and had started to bear its rotten fruit. There had been talk of the phantoms in the hills of the eastern wastes and how their ghostly songs had seemed to grow louder. As if they were emboldened by the growing darkness in the air, and folks began to presume they would eventually beset upon the outposts, and bring torment to those in their path. Most of these murmurs were brushed off as simple rumors of trail-maddened merchants, but, rumor or not, the people listened. And, ignoring their better senses, began to believe such stories. It had been 5 winters since Claus was victorious and reclaimed the farthest 2 garrisons. 5 winters since the might of Kingdom Claus was triumphant in what would be a smaller battle to much greater battles to come. 5 winters passed to what would mark the beginning of the 100-year war, and it would be here on the solstice of the 6th winter since that we should find such impending dread. Chapter 1. Menace. On the mountains. Winter had come to rest over the north. And a cold and bright morning broke over the southernmost village of the Free Mountains. These vast mountains were the home of the free tribes of the north, and this village was the realm of Grotto Bearsbane, a proud and large hulk of a man who now stared out onto burnt ruins that once was his domain. Smoke reached into the morning sky as skeletons of huts and longhouses still smoldered from the previous night's raid. Broken bodies of his mightiest warriors and the dark crimson of their blood now cover the otherwise pearl-white snow. The bare skull helm upon his large head crowns a lowered brow as he mournfully gazes upon the broken spears and arrows of a lost battle. The night raid by the bewitched Gordivalian soldiers was quick and brutal, and though many of Grotto's people still lived, his greatest warriors and kin lay slain. The forces of Amaranth came like a fog and were possessed of purpose. They could have easily taken the village in its entirety, but they didn't. They pulled back and left a crippled mass in their wake, like a cat playing with a mouse. Grotto wondered aloud to himself. Why? Why only this? There seemed to be no reason for such a half-hearted raid. Certainly not one that was so effective and yet seemingly didn't serve its purpose. All those of Grotto's folk that survived were both sorrowful and bewildered, Grotto most of all. He knew that his actions against Amaranth many moons ago would have repercussions, but not in such a strange fashion. And further still, this was not the first time such an illogical attack was laid upon his village, which added to his confusion. As he picked up the gnarled shaft of a broken spear, he thought to himself, they could have had us many times over. He thought it strange that victory was so clearly in their grasp and yet they would withdraw on the cusp of triumph. He wondered what night raids of this nature would accomplish. His village had no riches to speak of, and the southeastern realm already had all of the resources they could hope for, so why pillage and plunder such a meager township as was Grotto's? This place was only but a dwelling, a foundation in which free folk could carve an existence out of the bounty of the very earth. Could their cause be out of vengeance? Could their actions be vindictive mania, a strike to answer Grotto's part in the battle 5 years before? If so, then why pull back on the summit of victory when vengeance was so close to being achieved? None of it made much sense to him, and he knew he needed to confer with wisdom. He needed Shula's advice. Shula was his village's shaman and wisest of his kinfolk, but she was nowhere to be found. This thought occurred to him as he looked around suddenly. In a panicky roar he commanded, "Where is Shula? Find her." A few villagers ran to answer Grotto's order and scurried about the ruins. They rummaged to her hut, which now was an overturned mound of wreckage. They scrambled through the debris, but found no trace of their shaman. They ran back to their chieftain. One of the villagers lowered their head and sadly announced, She is gone, my chief, she's not here. Grotto sunk with this news. He was strong of heart and body, but he knew far too well that his strength and pride was not enough for his people to strive. He needed wisdom and soul as well. The loss of his shaman would be detrimental to his tribe and would be more than reason for his kin's hopes to sink into despair. And now he had many questions that needed advice, and he had no one to turn to. Each of the tribes of the Free Mountains had a shaman, to aid in the rule of each tribe's chieftain. Much like the chieftains themselves, the role of shaman was handed down through generations, each one passing on knowledge of ancient times to help in the governing of the future. These shamans were of magic ilk and could see things all others could not. They knew things of the north. And, further still, of the ways of the ancient earth. Their role to their tribe was crucial, and for a shaman to be suddenly missing put an all-consuming worry into Grotto. My chief. A villager began with a forlornly voice. It appears that she has been taken. Grotto's thick brow raised at this notion, as he surmised that this outcome was the most likely. Shula was brave, and her long age wrought a resolve that was of iron ore. She would not have abandoned her place to her kin and run screaming into the night. She would have taken a spear through her heart rather than forsake her people. She would have had to be abducted, absconded away with the demon marauders of the new Gordeval. But why? Why would they seek her and run off with their quarry like thieves to their hoards? The great chief of the southernmost free village pondered this for a moment and concluded to no avail. Though he had no answer as to why, he supposed as to what, and determined that his beloved shaman had been taken in the night. But again, only one question raced through his mind: why? Did she know something he did not? Something of critical importance? Perhaps it was something he did not need to know. It was no secret that the shamans of the Free Mountains were in possession of knowledge that others could only dream of knowing. Knowledge of things long gone and wisdom forged as far back as the very birth of the earth itself. Things that a brave and proud chieftain, such as he was, wouldn't need to know. Things that wouldn't directly affect his people to a certain extent, but things that could possibly be a threat to he and his kin. Such things, however, were so far removed from being an immediate threat that it wouldn't be necessary for any but the shamans to know of them. Grotto had always known that Shula and those of her ilk were far more powerful than their frail, old bodies let be known. Their power was in their ancient knowledge, a knowledge that had been passed down, generation to generation. A knowledge of ancient and ageless dangers whose secrets must be kept and never forgotten, though many of them were so. Secrets that only a very select few know now. Shula was one of them. But for the enemy to capture and pry such information from his shaman didn't make much sense to Grotto. Nevertheless, he supposed this was the case, and, for whatever reason Shula had been taken, he must find her soon. For the enemy to brave such an attack, they had to have had a good reason in doing so. Grotto then raised his hand and called forth a small group of villagers. He commanded onto them to search the southern ridges of the village for any sign of Shula and her possible captors. He then made a decree in a booming voice. My kin, make it be known that we venture north to Erman and his folk on this eve. I shall not risk any more harm to this place and to those who hold it dear. Ready yourselves and make north. With that command, the remaining villagers scurried about and gathered some provisions and prepared to journey a short north to Erman's village. Surely, the deeper they went into the mountain's arms, the safer they would be. And Erman would certainly not refuse them, as he is well aware of their plight. News of the night raids on Grotto's village echoed throughout the Free Mountains, leaving each tribe to wonder why and to outreach a helping hand. The villagers readied themselves as Grotto went to the southern watchtower and awaited news from the search party. It was approaching noon as the last of the villagers made their way north up the mountain road, and Grotto stayed his post, peering out from the watchtower into the trees. It was then that he heard the crunching of footsteps upon the snow. The search party had returned. He climbed down the ladder to greet them and anxiously asked what they had found, but their heads were lowered and forlorn was upon them. Grotto knew the answer without even asking, but he decided to ask anyway. Anything? Said he, almost rhetorically. No. My chief. There are tracks heading south, but they vanish a few leagues out without a trace, one of the search party responded. Vanished? Grotto asked with a deep whisper. Aye. As if a wind took them away, another of the party replied. There hadn't been any winds that night or through the morning, at least any that would have been strong enough to blow footprints from the wet snow. Grotto felt in his heart of hearts that something fell was at work here and none of it was natural. He gathered his racing mind and let out a tremendous sigh. His eyes deepened as he spoke. "Ready yourselves, lads. Gather what food stores we have left and slay up a mammoth. We head for Erman. Tess will help us find some answers, hopefully that old bird of hers can still see like a bastard." The search party dispersed to follow their chief's commands. Grotto then turned and said, "Call for Arjux." Arjux was Grotto's giant bear who served as his mount and was his eldest friend. One of the search party took a small ivory horn from their belt and blew upon it. A deep booming drone sounded through the forest and soon a distant rustle was heard in the brush. It drew nearer and with a growl, a giant brown bear sauntered from the trees. This was Arjux. He was the greatest amongst all of the bears in the north and he was old. His giant muzzle was graying but still seemed fierce and no one would dare assume that his old age has dulled his huge claws or lessened his strength. An old bear was still a bear, after all. He grumbled and rumbled as he greeted his friend, Grotto. He sniffed the air and stood up on his hind legs. He towered above Grotto, who was himself a giant of a man. Arjux let out a friendly roar and Grotto hugged him warmly. "Time for us to go, old man," Grotto said as he scratched Arjux on the back. One of the search party brought forth a great leather saddle and harness and proceeded to affix them upon Arjux. Grotto mounted up as the sound of great footsteps and sleigh blade upon the snow could be heard. A grand mammoth came lumbering up through the village, pulling an oak and iron sleigh. Grotto and the search party went on through the burnt ruins of their once proud village, on up the mountain road, and onward north to Erman's lands. Far behind them, peering from behind a tree, a Gordivalian soldier steps quietly forth and begins to follow them. He stays far behind Grotto and the small Exodus, slinking about and tracing their path. He weaves in and around the trees, staying off the mountain road as to avoid leaving any tracks. His silver Gordivalian helm was covered by a white hood and the cloak attached to it hid his body amongst the snowy brush. He was a white shadow, secretly in pursuit of his prey. His mission was not to kill, for he was no assassin. He was to follow and learn of the mountain road, where and how far the other villages were from one another. He was a spy. His yellow-hazed eyes peered from under his hood as Grotto's party neared the wooden walls of Erman's village. This village that had once looked quite humble, now was a grand structure of a mountain battlement. Such grand strongholds were never before needed in this realm nor any other upon the mountains. Fear would lead to readiness, needed or not. The huts and longhouses were now shielded on the southern side with a crudely constructed wall of fell trees, tightly roped together with a heavy oaken door in the center. The villages of the Free Mountains were never before fortified, but the news of the night raids had spread to all of the tribes, and with this new menace, each village was now a fortress, fearing to be sieged upon. These phantom raids only fell upon Grotto's folk as it was, but now that his realm had been defeated, it was only a matter of time before these night marauders would try to break the other villages. Grotto and his party reached the door of Erman's fort as a light snow began to fall. With it came a sharp breeze from the south and Arjux turned his giant head to face it. His nose expanded and contracted, wiggling from side to side. Something had been brought with the breeze and Arjux, the good and mighty bear he was, smelled something, or rather, someone. For the Gordivalian spy, a strange bit of misfortune blew in with that breeze and now he stood hiding amongst the trees, downwind to the greatest and fiercest bear in the north. He's caught wind of something, Grotto said, looking and squinting towards the possible source. Moment upon moment passed, still and quiet. Arjux remained sniffing as though his nose was asking questions of the wind. The party pointed their spears southward, waiting for some foe to jump out at them. Nothing would surprise them at this point and they half expected an ambush. They waited motionless, but nothing save for the feathery falling of the light snow moved among the trees. Grotto felt the muscles on Arjux's back tighten as the great bear's nose writhed from side to side. The breeze seemingly stopped as suddenly as it started and all was quiet. Grotto and the others stayed perfectly still as Arjux snorted and sniffed. All that could be heard was the soft sound of falling snow landing upon the ground. The spy, as bewitched as he was, knew that he was in danger of being discovered. He stayed as still as stone, waiting for the axe to fall. It's nothing," Grotto said, breaking the deathly silence. He looked up to the wall and yelled, "Ermin's folk, Bearsbane stands before your door." The great oaken door of the fort opened slowly and the party made their way in. The door was just big and tall enough for the Grand Mammoth to hunch through. Grotto felt an immense shame as he realized that he had not only lost his realm and his mightiest warriors, but he also had no idea where his shaman was, or if she was even still alive. Nevertheless, the remainder of his people were now safe within Ermin's village, but he wondered for how long. Could it be that he has done nothing but brought the same ill that his village had suffered to this place? He would fret this, and he knew in his heart that Ermin did too. Ermin had a shaman as well, so did all of the chieftains. Thorndro was his name, and he knew exactly what Shula knew. This is what would come to worry Ermin the most. If the enemy sought whatever information Shula knew and couldn't retrieve it, then they would surely seek it with the next best target. With his exile, Grotto brought immense danger with him, and it has yet to be seen if it would come to fruition. With everyone safely inside, the great oaken door closed, and outside the fortress walls, the white-shadowed spy turns south and makes his way back from whence he came. He had gotten what he sought and his mission had been fulfilled. Throughout all of his slinking, he had been counting the paces of his steps. He was all the while uncovering the secrets of the mountain road's riddles. He was following his orders, and he was performing like a puppet for his master. Kester had sent him forth to discover the way to what he sought most of all. Kester, in all of his vileness, was looking for something.